Okay, great. We're so privileged to have Neal with us today. So he's a professor of mathematics at the University of Washington, and he invented elliptic curve cryptography. So the importance of elliptic curve cryptography really can't be underestimated. For me, it's the most interesting thing that I've done in my whole career, and it really is the basis of much of what we do on the internet. The connection that you have just now is likely to have involved an elliptic curve Diffie-Hellman key exchange to make sure that we have the security. In Bitcoin and Ethereum, we use ECDSA, the elliptic curve digital signature algorithm. And it's now a fundamental part. Without it, we would really struggle to be able to create trust in the systems that we have just now. So, Neal, what's your current role, and what does a typical day for you involve?
I'm teaching still at the University of Washington, and it depends a lot on what day it is and what year it is. This year, I'm chair of the graduate admission committee, which is a lot of work, and so I'm doing more of that than actual teaching. And most recently in cryptography, I was spending a lot of time writing a joint paper with some colleagues in India about lattice-based cryptography and about critiquing claims of provable security of learning with error-based crypto systems, which are sort of a big thing now.
Yep. So you're known for elliptic curve cryptography, ECC. Could you just give us a quick, I know it's a very complex, you say in your book, it's a very complex principle, but could you quickly summarize what elliptic curve cryptography is all about?
Well, actually, the statement about it being very complicated was due to Ron Rivest in the 1990s, when there was sort of a competition going on between RSA and elliptic curve cryptography, and people whose background was largely in computer science or in other areas perceived elliptic curve because it was sort of new to, it didn't have other applications before then in areas related to cryptography anyway. So it was perceived as being this new type of mathematics that people hadn't studied. But in the mathematical world, it's a very well-established field. And in fact, both Vic Miller, who was the co-developer of elliptic curve cryptography with me, independent co-discoverer of it, both he and I had worked with elliptic curve in our PhD dissertation just a few years before. So it's the type of thing people working in number theory and arithmetic algebraic geometry were having in our minds pretty much all the time. But what really made it seem like a natural way to go was when Hendrik Lenstra used elliptic curves, showed how to use elliptic curves for factoring large integers and attacking RSA. And that was the first time, to my knowledge, that elliptic curves had ever been considered for application related to cryptography. So it was a natural thing to think about elliptic curves. And the basic idea, it grows out of the original Diffie-Hellman paper in 1976 called New Directions in Cryptography, which, by the way, is probably the most important paper ever written in the history of cryptography. It's a wonderful paper. The technical content was largely the development of the Diffie-Hellman key exchange, where they were working in the multiplicative group modulo a prime. So just all integers considered modular a prime under multiplication, and developed a key exchange, key agreement method that used the so-called discrete logarithm problem, which is just the inverse of modular exponentiation, modulo a large prime. And so with elliptic curve cryptography, you do the same type of thing. It's a discrete log problem, but not in the group of integers modular a prime, but rather the group of points on an elliptic curve defined over a prime field. And that so in a way, the most basic thing about elliptic curves is that their points form a group. The elliptic curve is sort of, it's one level more complicated than a conic section. Of course, conic sections also have a group, like a circle is a group, but an elliptic curve is a group which is in a way like the product of two circles. Over the complex numbers, it's literally the product of two circles. It's a torus. It relates to a circle the same way as the XY plane relates to the x-axis. So it's a natural step to go above conic sections. It's sort of the next stage. And so for both reasons, because of Hendrik Lenscher's work on elliptic curve factorization, and also because it's just a natural thing to look at if you're interested in group structures. And because a whole lot was going on with elliptic curves at that time. After all, in 1984, 85, when this was going on, was also the time when Gerhard Frey had conjectured that if one could prove a basic conjecture about elliptic curves, one would have Fermat's last theorem. So in the history of that problem, it's completely unrelated to cryptography, but at least it shows how elliptic curves were very much on a lot of people's minds at that time.
Yeah, that's great. And you had a very unusual path through your early years at school. Can you actually outline some of the challenges that you faced? You moved around quite a bit when you were younger. How did that influence you and the things you went on to do?
Well, the most influential thing in my childhood was the year that my family spent in India. And the Indian school was more advanced than the American school I was going to. So I learned more there. And when I came back to the US, especially in math, and when I came back, entered the third grade, my teachers thought I was pretty smart, but they didn't know that I'd just gone to a better school in India. So they encouraged me a lot, and math became the one thing I was good at as a result. So that had a huge influence. And it also had a huge influence on things outside of mathematics because for a kid that age, I was 6 at the time, the encounter with poverty was really shocking and was a sort of vivid example of social injustice that at that age really sticks with you. So that influenced my direction and political activism later on. I'd say that was the most important part, the most important thing that was unusual and highly influential in my childhood. And I think a lot of people have had experiences like that. You know, if they going abroad when they're very young can really influence someone's direction later in their education and in their life.
Yeah, and what got you into cryptography?
Well, actually, I was following RSA. I read Scientific American that had this really influential article, I believe in 1977, about it. And then when I started teaching number theory courses, I decided that I didn't agree with the way number theory was used by other people teaching it, which is that it was used as students' introduction to theory, to proofs. There's nothing wrong with that, except that number theory is a very concrete thing, and I thought that students would better relate to it, especially since now it has this big application in RSA. So I changed textbooks and taught RSA. In fact, I sort of focused the course around. I included everything that was necessary in order to really understand RSA, all the background. And that was my introductory course in number theory. So I first really was looking carefully at it in order to teach it. So that's why I was thinking about cryptography. And then when I was at the time, I was thinking about using elliptic curves in cryptography. in very early 1985, I was in the Soviet Union on an exchange program between the academies of science of the US and the USSR, and nobody there openly worked in cryptography. And so I, as an American, certainly wasn't going to find out anything about cryptography there. So I wrote to Andrew at LISCO and suggested, maybe people should look at elliptic curves for the Diffie-Hellman key exchange and encryption and things. And he wrote back, and in those days, it took a few weeks for mail to go back and forth between Moscow and New Jersey. And he wrote back and said, yes, he thinks that's a good idea. And in fact, Vic Miller was suggesting the same thing at the same time. And so that was great encouragement to me. I actually gave a talk on cryptography in Moscow when I was there, but this was before I heard from at LISCO. It was because, as I say, that took maybe almost a month to hear back from him. So I didn't say anything about elliptic curves in cryptography because I didn't know whether there's a good reason maybe why it wouldn't work. And so I just gave a general lecture on public key cryptography and some of the other things going on. And it was kind of amusing because it was, well, on the one hand, it was really a scary experience for me because I've never before or since been in the presence of so many eminent mathematicians. At that time, there were more top mathematicians in Moscow than in any other city of the world. And most of them came to the weekly meeting of the Moscow Math Society. And so weekly, or maybe it was only monthly, I don't remember, but so I've never had an audience like that, so I was pretty nervous. And I had to practice a lot because I wasn't completely fluent in Russian. So it was sort of a scary experience in a way, but it was also a very amusing experience. And some of our friends in Moscow, especially the person who set this up, who proposed me as a speaker, Anatoly Fomenko, who's a topologist but also a friend, thought it was really great to have the first talk ever given at the Moscow Math Society on cryptography be given by an American. Wow. So that was, there's a lot of irony there. Many years later, I ran into a prominent cryptographer named Semayev, who's made some real important contributions to attacks on various crypto systems. And I ran into him, and he told me that he was at that time working for the KGB as a cryptographer, because KGB included the Soviet analogy of the US NSA. And so he was in that type of a role. And he went to my talk. He was assigned to go to my talk to see what the American was going to say. And I told him, well, I didn't know that much cryptography at the time, so the talk must have been very boring for you. And he said, well, actually, there's one thing at the end that I didn't know about, that we didn't know about. And I told him, as a nice way to sort of end the talk, I told him about an idea that Gus Simmons had proposed of how public key cryptography could be used for arms treaty verification, a sort of type of use of public key that was a little bit reversed from the usual way it's used. And I described this and thought that, it's a kind of a nice way that the field could contribute to peace, because you usually think of cryptography in terms of war, but this would be in terms of a peace agreement. So that's how I ended the talk. And it turned out that he, as a KGB cryptographer, was not aware of how it could fit into test ban negotiations. So that was sort of enjoyable. So that was my early foray into cryptography.
Yeah, that's amazing. And Martin Gardner was such a great writer and explainer of maths. And inside his column obviously he published the RSA method. It's strange when you think that the numbers that Rivest talked about is actually quite easy, even though they said it was going to take billions of years. Actually, it's quite trivial now. So did you know at the time, once you read that, was it a complete game changer for you? It was all bets off. This was now the future.
Well, I guess I didn't really learn much about cryptography until later. I couldn't really evaluate what type of impact this would have compared to the other approaches available for cryptography. What fascinated me, and I think quite a few mathematicians, was the notion of this area of number theory having that type of an application, something that important, both sort of in the historical sense. Cryptography is really a part of diplomacy and warfare. But the idea that now with e-commerce just starting or almost starting at that time, that things like elliptic curves could play a role in that was really startling and in some sense exciting. But also we were reminded that people would think at that time about what G.H. Hardy's famous statement about how number theory is gentle and clean, unlike other areas of mathematics that get applied to warfare. And here number theory was becoming the central mathematical tool used in cryptography, which is commonly associated with warfare a lot. So we went, well, what would G.H. Hardy think of this?
Yeah, and you talk about Lenstra and his paper, which was completely different to many methods. He was using elliptic curves to crack the factorization. So what do you remember about reading Lenstra's paper?
Well, it was a very clever use of elliptic curves in a sort of strange situation, because it was elliptic curves defined over the integers modulo a composite number, namely the number you're trying to factor. Which is not really a natural thing to look at in pure mathematics, but he was able to use it very cleverly to sort of, because in a way the group doesn't quite work there, and that's exactly why his method works, because you can get you don't have the group axioms if you consider the elliptic curve modulo a composite number. So very much like it's very much analogous to how you don't have a multiplicative group if you look at non-zero numbers modulo the multiplicative. If you multiply numbers modulo a composite number and look at the non-zero numbers, that's not a group, because you have numbers that are not zero but still have a common factor with the modulus. So you have a sort of messy situation if you do multiplication modulo a composite number, and a much neater situation if it's modulo a prime number. Similarly, for an elliptic curve, it's much nicer over modulo a prime number than modulo a composite number. But Lenstra was able to use that weakness of working modulo a composite number to actually attack the factorization problem. So it was very clever. It was completely a new approach to factorization. Now, as it turned out, it did not have a major impact on cryptography because the running time was quite comparable to other methods that were known. And it had some advantage in that if one of the factors of the number was considerably smaller than the other one. If you have a product of two primes and one of them is considerably smaller than the other, then the elliptic curve factorization method would be faster than the other fastest known methods. Otherwise, it would be a comparable time to the best methods known, or maybe a little worse, but of the same order of running time. Whereas if you had, there are some applications where you might have numbers that you have to factor that are not the product of large primes, and so the one unique advantage of the elliptic curve factorization method is that its running time depends on the size of the smallest prime factor. So it doesn't give you anything much if the two prime factors are the same size, you know.
Yeah.
But in there are some situations where you might want to factor a number that has prime factors of very different size.
Yeah.
But that's a relatively minor thing. The real impact was that it taught us that some methods of some mathematical tools that we never thought would be applied to anything really could be.
Yeah, that's great. And he created latex, Byzantine fault tolerance, and so on. He contributed so much to the area. So if we wind forward from 1978 and that time of the Diffie-Hellman paper, then RSA, it was 1987 was when you published your paper. What's your memories of publishing? Were you that paper? Did you know it was going to be an amazing paper? Were you excited about it?
Well, I already had some contact with people in cryptography, and I knew there was some interest in elliptic curve cryptography. And I guess I went to my first crypto conference in '87, about the time that the paper appeared. But there was already some talk about it, and I was kind of surprised to meet with some people. First, I met with somebody from Israel who said that they were interested in maybe implementing elliptic curve cryptography, and I talked with him. But what really struck me and really impressed me was about a year or two later when I met Scott Vanstone visiting from Waterloo, coming to the crypto meetings, and his star student, Alfred Menezes, and talking with them, and found that they were really serious about implementing it. And it was something very concrete they were going to work on. They had an active group involving undergraduates, graduate students, engineers, people, and of course mathematicians, who had been working for a few years on improved efficiency in implementing finite field algorithms. And so now they wanted to apply that to elliptic curves, and they started the Certicom company to actually commercialize elliptic curve cryptography. And then when I started visiting Waterloo to work with them, I was really very impressed and surprised at how things are going full speed ahead at implementing and marketing products, involving elliptic curve cryptography.
Yeah, that's amazing. So there's so many patents that have been defined: RSA, Diffie-Hellman, Peter Schnorr, just coming out of patent. Now the DSA patent, which obviously was assigned to the US government. So there has been so many. Merkel was obviously another one. You didn't patent, and you actually didn't really commercialize what you had actually created. Do you regret that now?
Not really. I mean, I didn't think of it as the type of thing that would be immediately commercialized. I didn't think of it as being a competitor to RSA. Interestingly, neither did Vic Miller, although in Vic Miller's case, I think there was a different reason. In my case, it was just because I wasn't thinking along those lines. And it had never occurred to me. Well, I was trained in pure mathematics, so it never occurred to me. And I never worked I spent one summer when I was a kid at IBM, but I never worked for a company in a serious way. So it just didn't occur to me. The idea that I would ever have a patent, and I never have, just didn't seem like anything I would ever do. In fact, being trained in pure mathematics, I assumed that I would never do anything useful. I mean, anything useful in the practical sense.
Yeah.
So, but in Vic Miller's case, it was quite different because he was working for IBM at the time, and IBM had a reputation for getting patents for everything under the sun.
Yeah.
And so I thought, well, maybe he was just doing this on the side and didn't realize its importance from a practical standpoint. He told me, no, that wasn't the case. He told me that actually he would have gotten a patent, but IBM didn't want to get a patent for it because they didn't want anything that would distract attention from DES, which was, I guess, their moneymaker in cryptography.
Wow.
And so they were happy to keep it on the back burner. So I don't know. You have to ask him or ask somebody at IBM if they regret not getting a patent on it. But I don't like the idea of patents. I don't think ideas should be patentable anyway. I think there are a lot of patents in cryptography that do more harm than good because they discourage. Patents can actually discourage innovation, which is the opposite of their purpose, if they're too broad, or if they are patent the types of things that are like mathematical concepts.
Yeah.
And I've seen examples of things like that, just horrible patents that get approved, even though they're not the type of thing that should be patented. I think the general idea of elliptic curve cryptography should not be patentable. Specific implementations, or specific engineering tricks or something are another matter.
Yeah, that's amazing. I mean, it probably is also the fact that nobody saw the potential, as you say, of this amazing thing. And if a company like IBM didn't see it, and obviously DES is a symmetric key method, so they probably thought that RSA was the only show in town and that there wasn't to be anything else from there. So what were the crypto conferences of 1981 like? What do you remember about the rump sessions? You talk about it in your book, that Witt had to impose restrictions on what could be thrown
Yeah,
at the presenter.
yeah.
Well, it was like a wild west of crypto at that time?
Well, it was a lot of fun in those days. I didn't go in the early 80s. I wasn't in cryptography then. But when I started going in sort of the mid to late 80s, I think 87 was the first one I went to. Uh, I was really struck. I really liked it a lot because it was very interdisciplinary. I was meeting engineers, computer scientists, people who worked in industry. It was very different from a pure math conference where everybody would be academic, pure mathematicians in those days at a math conference. So mathematics was not nearly as interdisciplinary then as it is now. And here was an opportunity to meet all sorts of people in different fields and learn about things that were very far from what my interests had been formerly. So, and the spirit was there was a certain amount of I don't know what you'd call it, maybe uh, uh, rebellious. There was sort of a rebellious side to academic and even corporate work in cryptography because the U.S. government was opposed to it. They wanted NSA to have a monopoly on that sort of thing. And there was a big controversy in the early 80s when NSA uh, tried to acquire the right for prior review of work in number theory, and they didn't get it, but it was a big debate. It really caused a lot of people outside government working in cryptography to get pretty angry and to develop a very defiant feeling about it. On the other hand, there wasn't money in cryptography, in academic cryptography really at that time, or at least not much. And RSA even was not really used in practice extensively until a few years later. So there wasn't much money, but there was a lot of excitement, if for no other reason. We were doing something the government didn't want us to do, which is always sort of fun to see what you can get away with. But something we believed in doing because it had applications to people's right to privacy and so on. And I think Whit Diffie, just this wonderful personality at these meetings. He was the one who would run the rump sessions in those years. With a lot of humor, a lot of irony, a lot of joking around and sort of playful fighting of some sort, or heckling rather. It was that sort of a freewheeling spirit in cryptography. Unfortunately, that changed in the 90s, just as money started coming in and as the corporate world became much more interested in computer security and cryptography. than it had been in the 80s. Then also the cryptography world started to become very professionalized. People had a bunch of graduate students. The graduate students had to get papers published in the conference proceedings, and there was a lot of emphasis on sort of the careerist aspect of things and the financial aspect of things. It became much more competitive, somewhat less collegial. Conflicts arose, and it became, sometimes cryptographer versus cryptographer, sort of like spy versus spy, but at its worst. But unfortunately, sometimes the more prestigious conferences. So crypto was transformed from being a sort of freewheeling, almost sort of anarchistic type of a crazy fun event to being a very serious professional conference where people's careers were in the balance, and there was a lot of controversy over who should have. It also became, since there was such a flood of work started to go into cryptography and huge numbers of papers being written, it was very competitive to get into the crypto conference, increasingly through the 90s, and the acceptance rate of papers went way down. And there were a lot of, so controversies became quite nasty at times. And I think to some extent, the flavor of the conference was not as good in later years. And the same probably goes for some of the other crypto conferences, except for the ones that are not at all prestigious. They can still be fun.
Yeah, because I think you actually got an award at Real World Crypto. So I think that was that conference is trying to address the barrier that we have. So you are a rather unusual academic in the way that you write your papers. You're typically the first author, and there are very few authors on your paper. So it's a very traditional approach to your writing rather than big teams. And you've really teamed up with Alfred Menes for so long. What is it? Because I talk to some other researchers and they say the team works because, like with EdDSA, you maybe have the dynamics of the cracker against the thinker. What is it with your teamwork with Alfred that works so well?
Well, he's the most careful reader of papers and thinker about people's work that I've ever met. He's just extremely conscientious in ways that very few people are, and I'm not. And he has really good ideas. Really good proposals. He was the one who suggested that it might be worthwhile to systematically critique the way provable security is used in cryptography. And I was already skeptical about it because of a couple cases that I happened to know about, but I didn't know much about it. I just was skeptical about some of the things I'd heard. And so we started working on that. We'd already collaborated a little bit on elliptic curve cryptography. In fact, he's the first person to write a book entirely devoted to elliptic curve cryptography. It was basically came out of his PhD thesis in, I believe, maybe 93 or roughly it appeared. So he's a natural person for me to work with. But then over the last maybe 20 years, our collaboration has been on the issue of provable security and sort of critiquing the mathematics. And since he and I are both trained as mathematicians, we're both sort of sensitive to how mathematics is being used, and we're sensitive to issues of rigor. And I guess it comes in the nature of a mathematician to get bothered if somebody is asserting that something's rigorously proved when it really isn't. So that was something we had in common. But also, I think my role a little bit is to say something to say something. Sometimes, I'll write the most sort of provocative parts of our paper. If you compare the joint papers with the papers that just he writes, the ones he writes are very, hardcore, technical, everything there. Everybody would have to agree with because it's just a math paper, in a way, or it's like a math paper. It's complete, the facts and everything in detail and everything correct. The parts that I write tend to be more provocative and with, I don't know, analogies to Alice in Wonderland and quotes from popular music groups and mildly obscene references and things like that, that I don't think Alfred would feel comfortable doing on his own.
Yeah.
So I'm willing to be a little bit, I don't know, I guess unpopular I've become more unpopular in certain circles than I intended to be, but as a result of all this provable security, the critique of provable security. But I think we really work very well together, and in some way our style complements each other. He's very careful in what he says, and thinks about it deeply, and I'm a little bit more sort of shoot from the hip at times. But I mean, maybe I'm exaggerating that. I try to be careful with what I say, but some people wouldn't agree with that.
I think that's great advice. I mean, a great advice for a good research team is to have someone who's really grounded, who will look at the detail and the grammar and the structure and so. But there is also the dreamer, the visionary, who can write the start and the ends and who can really set out the picture, paint a picture. So I think you're right to have that strong team. And I love the way in your book you have such a passion for teaching, and it hurts you sometimes. And you talk about Cliff Stahl in there. What inspired you about him?
Well, when I was a program chair for Crypto 96, I thought the conference has to be livened up, and we need more invited speakers, because invited speakers who are not talking about a technical topic can talk about something that everybody will understand. And there were not parallel sessions, and I think there still aren't parallel sessions in that. So that means it's expected that everybody should attend every talk. And yet they were traditionally just these very technical, narrow things where people would basically read their paper. So I tried to liven things up. And so instead of having 2 invited speakers, I had 6 that year. Which was controversial in and of itself, because it meant that we could accept maybe 3 or 4 fewer contributed papers, maybe 32 instead of 36 or something. So, but Cliff Stahl gave a really great talk, because he has had all these sort of heretical notions about things, and he would sort of make some outrageous comments about people who are sort of narrowly focused on in computer science. And what I knew about him was mainly initially through his best-selling book on how he helped trace a cyber attack coming from intelligence agents in East Germany or something on the Lawrence the Lawrence laboratory computer system, and on the U.S. military computer system. So he was involved in a real sort of spy versus spy episode as a systems person there at Lawrence Livermore, and wrote a best-selling book about it. I think it's called The Cuckoo's Egg, I believe, a reference to how the tactics used by the attackers. And then he wrote a book that I think it was called something like High Tech Heresy, although that might have been the name of the second edition of the book. No, I think the first edition had a different title. But anyway, he was very critical of all the hype that was going on about the computer age and everything. and made all sorts of statements, some of which turned out to be false. He thought that email would never replace ordinary letters. They weren't nearly as good as ordinary letters, so that didn't turn out that way. But other things were prescient, and he did agree with me about some of the areas of skepticism, especially in the area of education. We were in complete agreement about that. And he was very glad to get my what I'd written about it, because in the second edition of his book, he also talked about the hype about computers in education that was going on. That was really big in the 90s, and in some circles still is. And he was very skeptical about that. And he and I agreed completely on that issue. And so I like that. But I guess mainly as far as his performance at crypto, it was really sort of theatrical, and he got into a sort of carried away with describing some scene. I don't remember the details. I do remember that Whit Diffie was angry about it afterwards, because Cliff had said something which was sort of in the poetic license category. It didn't square with the year he gave. It was impossible. There was something that was just historically wrong about it, and Whit Diffie spotted this, and his talk was supposed to be factual, and then he got off onto a sort of imaginary thing, and so that was just not very honest. But I thought it was just his style, and so he was just a very entertaining guy and a very provocative guy, and I thought it was like a breath of fresh air to hear some skepticism in the midst of all the hype about the computer age at that time.
That's interesting. And you talk in your book about SPI versus SPI, and you just outlined there about all that competition, that the builder can actually be the destroyer. And do you still think it's true in the industry? Is there still that adversarial approach, and is that a good thing? Does it help science?
Well, I think one thing that makes it sort of fun to work in cryptography is that the whole, by definition, when you work in cryptography, you're thinking about an adversary. You know, there's some sort of conflict going on. There's someone who's trying to invade your privacy, or steal your credit card, or whatever information is protected, get access, unauthorized access. Whatever cryptography is protecting, there's somebody out to get it. You know, otherwise it wouldn't have to be protected. And so you have to try to imagine what your adversary is like. So it's sort of like a quasi-military situation, which usually you think of science as being just the opposite, the scientific thinking being the opposite of, say, military thinking or fighting. But in this case, they sort of come together, and that provides drama and interest and makes it attractive to a lot of people. It also makes it attractive to students. And I think one of the ways to liven up mathematics, for example, number theory, you know, that's what I saw early on when I started teaching number theory, that it would really be a much livelier course, a more livelier topic to teach if I used cryptography to motivate it. And so, I mean, it's easy to convince students that the subject's an important subject with practical significance, you know, because of relating to things from warfare to e-commerce. So it does make it a nice subject to think about, to work on, and to teach because of that. On the other hand, there is this conflict that arises in the professional world, sort of professional rivalries and you know, competition for scarce places. You know, for example, in the program of a prestigious crypto conference, and people are sort of jockeying for power, that sort of thing, and people have competing patents, and you know, there have been lawsuits in various directions, and people testifying for opposite sides of lawsuits, and then of course there's cryptocurrencies have really in fact, the term crypto now in the outside world doesn't even mean cryptography. It means cryptocurrencies. So someone who's sort of a pure scientist might resent that and think that the field has been corrupted in a way, and even our name of crypto has been stolen from us.
That's right. Yeah, I mean, crypto.com was kept for so long, and the academic who owned that kept it. But obviously, it was worth so much money that it was eventually sold. So we see quantum computers coming along, and they will break elliptic curve. They will break RSA and discrete logs. So your area is now in provable security. So could you just outline how you can do something so difficult as to prove that something really is secure?
Well, the idea of provable security is that if you look at the tasks an adversary has to perform, like even in RSA, where it's pretty simple what the adversary has to do, the adversary um, has to find the decryption exponent, knowing only the encryption exponent and the modulus, basically, to entirely break the system. And this can be done easily if the adversary can factor n. But it's not true that it hasn't been proved that that's the only way, that only by factoring in can you get the decryption exponent. So ideally, to be sure that, so in a sense, you don't know as an absolute fact that breaking RSA is as hard as factoring. You just know it's in the other direction, that it's certainly no harder than factoring, because if you can factor, you can break RSA. But it's theoretically conceivable that RSA could be easier to break than factoring. And so in provable security, what you try to do is show that the basic problem that your system is based on is actually provably equivalent to the adversary's task. That is, the adversary really has to do that, would solve discrete logarithm, find a discrete logarithm, or whatever it is. In the case of lattices, it's some type of problem involving finding a short vector or a set of short vectors in a lattice. And it's not in order to design an efficient crypto system, you rarely can use a well-studied classical problem directly. You sort of use it indirectly, the way factorization was used in RSA. Because of that, the idea is that you can get more confidence in the security of your system if you can prove that the adversary's task reduces to the other way around. Your hard problem reduces to the adversary's task. So the adversary's task must be at least as hard as this hard problem. So, for example, if you could show that if any adversary who can find the decryption exponent could use that knowledge to factor n, but that's not known how to do that efficiently. So if you could show that anyone who could break the system could also factor n, that would show that factoring n is equivalent to breaking the system, because you know the other way around. So provable security involved proving basically equivalences like that between the difficulty of breaking the system, breaking the protocol, and solving some well-established mathematical problem. In the case of lattice-based cryptography, it's some version of a short vector problem. And that can be worth knowing if that's true. The trouble is that, well, for one, the terminology is terrible to call provable security, because it's not provable security. Just proving that two things are equivalent doesn't prove that either one of them is hard, you know. And in any case, crypto systems are almost never broken mathematically. They're almost always broken because of the intricacies of implementations, or because they were implemented wrongly, or because of some side channel attack, or or just because somebody got bribed. I mean, there are, it's kind of really unusual for a fundamental mathematical problem to be solved, and that's how the cryptosystem gets broken. So, but putting that aside, so provable security could lead to a false sense of security among users because their system's going to get broken if they try to cut corners on implementation and so on. So it's a bad term, but also there's a big gap between theory and practice. Like I remember a speaker, it might have been, well, I don't remember. I'm not sure who it was, but some speaker I heard said, put up a slide saying, in theory and practice are the same. In practice, they're completely different. And I think provable security is a good example of that because you have something like a polynomial time reduction from one problem to another. And when you try to make that very specific, that was an effort that started especially with Bellari and Ragaway's work on what they call practice-oriented provable security, that is trying to make very concrete what your guarantee is. Then you run into all sorts of interesting issues. The easiest one to explain probably is the tightness gap issue, which means the following. Let's just say you could prove that RSA is provably secure in the sense that the adversary's task is every bit as hard as factoring, and that's provable. The way you do that would be to say, well, if you had this adversary and used the adversary as a subroutine, you could factor the modulus in polynomial time. So modulo being able to do what the adversary does, you've got a polynomial time algorithm for factoring. Well, that's fine. It shows that in some theoretical computer science sense, they're equivalent problems because each one reduces to the other in polynomial time. But let's suppose that in order to factor n, you needed some, for the values of n that are used, 2048-bit integers n. In order to factor it, let's suppose that this hypothetical adversary, a subroutine, had to be run trillions of times, 2 to the 50th power times, say. Well, then that would mean that however long the adversary took, factoring would take 2 to the 50th times as long. So it's a practical conclusion that wouldn't tell you anything because, that would just tell you that if you have confidence that the number can't be factored in less than 2 to the 100th computer operations, that would tell you that, well, that means that the adversary's task couldn't be performed in less than 2 to the 50th computer operations, which means it's not secure. So there's this issue of the tightness gap where people throw around polynomial time reductions from one problem to another as if calling it polynomial time guarantees that you get security. So that was one issue that we dealt with extensively in connection with so-called provable security assurances about about these post-quantum systems based on lattices. But it turned out there were a whole other bunch of issues, such as, for example, that these short vector problems were not really the basis for the cryptosystem. It was the approximate short vector problems where there was an approximation factor. So it wasn't that you getting the shortest vector in the lattice or finding a basis for the lattice with the shortest possible longest vector of the basis. Those there's a lot of evidence, a lot of confidence that those are really hard problems. But if you only have to get to within a certain approximation factor of the shortest, then it really depends on how big that approximation factor is. If the approximation factor is huge, then it might not be such a hard problem. And in fact, if the approximation factor is really huge, then it's known to be solvable quickly. So we looked at what the approximation factors were in these estimates, and it was not encouraging as far as the value of their proof of their so-called provable security was. So from a practical standpoint, I think we showed pretty overwhelmingly that their proof has zero practical significance, or it doesn't give a guarantee of anything in any mathematical sense. So as a mathematical, quote, proof of security, it's really not that in any sense. But it's the main form of argument that people have made for the security of lattice-based systems. So, you can have various opinions about the significance of that, but there are some practical consequences, I think, from showing that, from knowing that the provable security, so-called, of lattice-based crypto systems is completely impractical, and doesn't give a guarantee of anything in any practical sense.
Interesting. And we had the DSA signature method that eventually became the ECDSA, and Satoshi Nakamoto, whoever he or she was, adopted it for Bitcoin, and then Vitalik came along and adopted the ECDSA for Ethereum. And it's almost like the standard, but really we're struggling to scale ECDSA now. Peter Schnorr's method is out of patent, so we're actually seeing EdDSA being adopted in the FIPS 186 standard. So you worked on this and you defined ECDSA plus. Can you just outline what was the motivation?
Well, I wasn't really heavily involved in the ECDSA or improving it. I don't recall any specific, anything very specific about that. I'd say with ECDSA, I didn't come up with that. When I wrote my paper in 1987 doesn't deal with signatures. It was, I believe it was Scott Vanstone's group that first formulated ECDSA, and Alfred Menezes was involved in that, but I don't know the details about it. I frankly, when I started working cryptography, I did not understand the importance of signatures. I had the naive view that most people have, which is that cryptography means encryption. And it was only much later that I realized, the RSA people really knew this very well, because the title of their paper had signatures in it. They understood that signatures were really the one area where public key cryptography was absolutely indispensable, more than in any other area. And so I didn't work on signatures in the years when I was, actively doing elliptic curve cryptography. Now, as far as different types of curves are concerned, one thing I worked on was curves that have certain efficiency advantages over finite fields, so I worked a little bit on that aspect of it. And then more recently, people like Dan Bernstein have proposed very efficient families of curves that have advantages in terms of perhaps resisting certain side channel attacks and so on, and implementation advantages. But I think the reason why, to get back to what you were saying about cryptocurrencies using ECDSA, I think what happened starting in around 2000 or a little after, was that there was a growing realization that although RSA was very firmly established in many, many computer systems and many, many protocols, so it wasn't going to go away anytime soon, but that any sort of new application of cryptography would be better off using elliptic curve cryptography. So things like smart cards and things that were developed or at least became widespread after around 2000. It made more sense to use elliptic curve cryptography because you could do it with smaller keys, and people became very sensitive to issues of when you have a smart card, you don't have the same room that you have on a desktop for memory and things. So people really wanted to optimize the key length. that became an important issue. Whereas if you have a legacy system on your computer, there's plenty of room on your computer for RSA, and there's plenty of time to implement RSA. But in more recent applications, people have tended to use ECC starting about 2 decades ago. So I don't think there is anything special or surprising about Vitalik Buterin's decision to use ECDSA rather than, say, RSA signatures. And that was even recommended by the NSA in 2005, I believe, when they bought some of they've licensed for Certicom's patents, and we're generally recommending that people switch to ECC when they have the chance to start fresh.
I'd say certainly in your early life, you were a rebel, you were a radical, you were anti-war. I'm not going to ask you whether you're still anti-war, but those thoughts obviously came together around the Vietnam War. And I appreciate your feelings, your political feelings at the time really bubbling up in you. But you really brought that all together with the cryptography in the paper that you talked about, the Vietnamese ciphers and crypto and its part in that war. I know it maybe isn't an easy topic for you to talk about, but can you just outline these Vietnamese ciphers and how they were used?
Well, this was really an interesting project for me because it did, as you say, sort of tie in with what was a sort of central concern of my generation in the 1960s and 70s, when the U.S. was pursuing this horrible war of aggression against Vietnam. And after that war ended in 1975 with the Vietnamese victory, my wife Ann and I started, starting in 1978, started visiting Vietnam and became very interested in working with the mathematical and scientific community there, also with the Vietnam Women's Union. We've been sponsoring a prize for women in science in Vietnam since 1985. Vietnam occupies a very special place for people of my generation. And I mean, it might be a little bit analogous to what happened in a slightly earlier generation when some German young people who felt very bad about what happened in their country, went to visit Israel to plant trees and do things like that. It just as a sort of symbolic form of reparations. And I think those of us who developed an interest in Vietnam have a large element of that. Of course, you can't make up for the atrocities that our country committed there, but you can be supportive in various ways. And so anyway, I got involved with Vietnamese co-author Van Dong Hue, I'm sure I'm mispronouncing his name badly, who works in France, but his family's in Vietnam. And he through his family has access to really good sources in Vietnam. And I was sort of concentrating on the American side of this cryptography issue. And he also, since he's working in French, my co-author also had some access to good sources on cryptography in France during the French imperialist war against Vietnam that ended in 1954 with the humiliation of French imperial forces. So we had a really good collaboration because he had the great Vietnamese and French access, and I had good access in the U.S. to sources. So looking at it from all these sides, we tried to see how it worked out, how cryptography worked out during the French and American wars in Vietnam. And we found some quite surprising things, and things that not only have we not known about, but were sort of counterintuitive. One thing I was very surprised by was to find out that in a book that I never read, it was about Nixon by Seymour Hersh. It's a journalist's account of all the crazy things Nixon did. But it turned out there was a very long footnote there about an episode that happened in Vietnam, the time of the Christmas bombings in near the end of 1972, when there was really a vicious attack on Vietnam. There were peace talks going on. The idea of Nixon was to intimidate the Vietnamese into more favorable terms for the U.S. Just a barbaric attack. And one thing that I learned, I didn't learn it from Seymour Hersh. I never read that book, but it turned out that it was also sort of confirmed in a declassified history of the NSA. That what happened was some Air Force people working in Air Force intelligence officers did what they were doing was intercepting. The thing is, the Vietnamese had a very hard time with real-time encryption, and so they could not. They were unable to use a strong form of cryptography to protect their anti-aircraft efforts against the U.S. bombers. So what happened was that the U.S. could decrypt them pretty quickly, and so the U.S. would monitor the traffic between the command and the anti-aircraft and the fighters that would go up for Vietnam, and would warn pilots. So these intelligence officers would be able to quickly either it wasn't encrypted at all, or it was encrypted using a very simple method that they could quickly read, and then they would communicate it to the pilots, so the pilots could avoid the areas or could avoid what was being planned, the anti-aircraft measures that were being planned. And for a period of 36 hours, those intelligence officers had what they called a no-heard protest. They pretended they didn't hear anything because they were so outraged by the bombing raids. Because they knew, as intelligence officers, they knew that Vietnam was preparing for the peace that was supposed to come. And in fact, just a month later, there was an agreement was signed that didn't really end the war, but it signaled the beginning of a process that ended the war. So the intelligence officers knew that Vietnam was already preparing for a big celebration of the peace. They were already starting to demobilize. They had already demobilized their anti-aircraft flights, but not the ground weapons. And so these officers just said no. These bombing them just to intimidate them was just inhumane. And so they just pretended they didn't hear anything. It just didn't do what they were supposed to do. And that probably saved a lot of civilian lives in Hanoi. Of course, they were court-martialed for it secretly, I believe, in Korea, but very little is known about it because it was really hushed up. And this was confirmed. I don't know. I think Seymour Hersh actually talked to some of the people involved, but I'm not sure what he did. The NSA declassified parts of this, not all the details, but enough. I could read enough of it that it confirmed everything that was in Hersh's account. The Air Force has never declassified any of it at all. So that was a big surprise to me, because at that time I remember distinctly that we were going around, collecting money to send to Vietnam to rebuild my hospital that was bombed and so on. We were doing things like that at the time and protesting. but it never would have occurred to us that U.S. intelligence officers were with us on this, that they were also in their own way protesting against this barbarity. So that was sort of a very rare, and it was sort of like, because we were doing this work of this, it wasn't very long after Snowden came through. So Snowden is this great historical example of someone who, a great risk to himself, was in the heart of the belly of the beast, so to speak, on contract with the NSA, and played a really big role in exposing some of the wrong things they did. And I saw this as a historical precedent where U.S. and people working in U.S. intelligence actually showed some humanitarian solidarity with the victims. And so that was really impressive. There were other things that were really fascinating. That the U.S., despite the huge technological advance that it had in cryptography, things were much more evenly balanced than you would have thought. There were a lot of things that went wrong in U.S. cryptography, not in the cryptography itself, which was very good. Vietnamese never broke the crypto systems that the NSA developed. They developed very solid crypto systems. The trouble was that the instrument that implemented the crypto systems worked badly in the heat of Vietnam. The heat and humidity, they worked badly. So people would do things like unscrew the cover to get better ventilation, and then plain text signals would leak out that way. And the National Liberation Front had cadre who knew about this and who essentially performed side channel attack on these devices. So they couldn't break the system, but they got around it another way on certain occasions. And the commanding general, General Abrams, was informed of this and was alarmed and told people to stop doing this, stop. But they didn't stop. So there are a lot of things that were really fascinating about this history. It was a lot of fun sort of working on it. And it was also, I gave a talk based on our paper at the first international crypto conference to be held in Vietnam, in the Asia Crypt series of conferences in 2016, met in Hanoi. And so I gave an invited talk on cryptography during the French and American wars in Vietnam.
Yeah.
That was also had a lot of irony in it, because this was in Hanoi, just a few miles away where a lot of this happened. And we weren't that far from my hospital in Vietnam. But of course it was a different world. Vietnam's far better off. They don't have the drastic poverty they had in the war years and the post-war years. It's very prosperous by comparison with those earlier times. And our conference was in a very ritzy hotel. It was kind of weird being in this ritzy hotel with all the comforts, giving a talk about something that happened just a few miles away.
Yeah. I could talk to you for hours. We need to call a halt. It's unfortunate. You created an amazing foundation for cybersecurity, for privacy, for trust, and so on. But you have a beating heart that has such passion, and the things you did when you were younger, you can actually see that you're now more grounded, but you have as much passion now about helping people and countries across the world. So it's nice to see that not only you're an academic, but you really care about things and to make things better.